We'll get started. So hello everybody and welcome to March's Armchair Travel event. It's great to see so many of you returning and some new faces in the crowd as well. I very much hope you enjoy this evening's event. This event is hosted by Distant Horizons and Temple World, who are two of our longest standing tour operators. In fact, this year we are marking 25 years of partnering with them. I'm also delighted to introduce and welcome this evening's speaker, Professor Jay Lewis, Associate Professor of Korean History at the University of Oxford. Jay will be leading two tours this September, one to Korea and the second to Japan. Just to remind you all the Armchair Travel events are recorded, including this evening's event, and if you have any questions, please do use the chat function below. And if you've missed any of the previous Armchair Travel events, they are all on the Cambridge alumni website. I'd now like to hand over to Alice and Daniel from Temple World and Distant Horizons.
Oh, thanks very much, Claire. Yeah, my name's Daniel Moore. I help manage the travel company Distant Horizons. We specialize in scholar-accompanied journeys to the lesser visited destinations around the world, and we try and involve experiences that allow the traveler to really get under the skin of the country. So that's our ethos. As Claire mentioned, weirdly enough, 2023, that's the 25th anniversary of the first ever journey that we organized with Cambridge alumni back in 1998. It was organized, or it was accompanied by Professor Charles Melville, back then to Iran in April 1998. And strangely enough, life has a habit of going in full circle. And Professor Charles Melville, will be accompanying the next 25th anniversary journey next month in April 2023 to Central Asia. In that time, we probably organized 250 to maybe 300 trips for Cambridge alumni. Just a couple of housekeeping points, if I may. Definitely, we'd encourage questions, but please use your chat box for the questions. I'll try and put those to Professor Lewis at the end of the talk. I know we've had a lot of questions in the registration process, and I know Jay is going to try and address some of those questions throughout his lecture and maybe at the end of his lecture too. If you would just permit me a quick canter through some of the journeys that Cambridge is organizing for 2023. In June of this year, Dr. Alex Koller is accompanying a trip to the southern brow of the Caucasus Mountains in North Georgia, an area of spectacular landscapes, but probably also of great cultural traditions. And Nirvana Ramel, in June of this year, is charting a course through the Western Balkans. This is a region that have highlighted millennia of cultural changes and various, I suppose, all the tectonic plates of Europe, whether it's cultural, political, or social, have all jostled over the last 2 millennia in that time. And hopefully Nirvana will I don't know, chart a course through those events. We've also got a journey to Burgundy, which is, of course, famous for its wine, and that will figure along with its cuisine in September of this year. But perhaps, I don't know, a region in France, more than any other, is well known as I don't know, a perfect union of culture, history, and nature. And then in September, Zara Fleming, who I think has accompanied probably about 10 journeys for the alumni over the years to the Himalayas. She's taking a trip to Bhutan, tiny but spectacular kingdom right in the high Himalayas. And of course, Professor Jay Lewis, today's lecturer, he will be accompanying a trip to Japan in September of this year. If any of those trips look of interest, then please do contact Distant Horizons. Address, and then all the details are on the Cambridge alumni website too. But in addition to Japan, Jay is also accompanying a trip to Korea, and that's being handled by Temple World. So I will hand over to Alice Burns of Temple World, to talk more about those trips.
Hello there. Thank you, Daniel. I'm Alice. I'm the director of Temple World. We are another one of the long-standing operators of the Alumni Travel Program alongside Distant Horizons. We're one of the originators of the Alumni Travel Program, actually. We have got 5 tours running for alumni in 2023, including a tour to Turkey, a Loire barge cruise, a tour to Egypt, a wildlife tour to Borneo, and the one that's the most relevant today, which is our exciting tour to South Korea, led by Professor Lewis. They can all be found on our website, but I thought I would just quickly give you a bit more info on the South Korea tour so you can see what we're doing on that. Thank you, Daniel. This is a 10-night tour. It covers most of the main historic sites. We've tried to keep it as reasonably priced as possible, but we'll be there in the autumn when hopefully the turning leaves will make everything extra beautiful. You've probably seen that happens in Japan as well. People don't know about South Korea's autumn leaves as it's not as well known, but it is just as stunning. We're starting and ending in Seoul, and we've obviously got loads of historic palaces to visit. We've got the brilliant National Museum, and we're going to be sampling some local dishes at the market. And of course, we are going up to the DMZ for the day as well. We are including a huge number of UNESCO listed sites during the tour, including Haho Folk Village, where you can get a feel for life during the Joseon dynasty. We'll spend a lovely couple of days in Jeongju, which is known as the Museum Without Walls, and its streets are absolutely littered with palace ruins and temples and pagodas. It was the capital of the Silla Kingdom for nearly 1,000 years. And if you have a look at the photo on the bottom left of this page, those old green hills are actually burial mounds for the kings that have been made into a park today that you can stroll around. We also visit Busan, which is on the coast. It's a beautiful stretch of coastline. And as with everywhere in South Korea, there are some incredible 14th century temples to see and some beautiful coastal walks and beaches on that particular stretch there. If you're intrigued by Korea's cuisine, don't worry, we do get a chance to try loads of the most famous dishes, and we've built quite a foodie element into this tour as well, alongside all the history. And you will get a journey on the superfast bullet train as well, which is exciting. We will have Professor Lewis on hand all the way through to get some really special insights. So you'll come away having thoroughly immersed yourself. We still have a few places left on this tour and also on our Borneo tour. Our other tours are looking pretty full at the moment. So do get in touch if you're interested. We don't think the places are going to stick around very long, and we would really, really love to have you along. Thanks so much, Daniel. If you could just pop our web address on there, it's just the next page. Thank you. That's how you find out about our tours. They're all listed on there, full itineraries and all the details, and just give us a shout if you have any questions. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Lewis for our educational talk this evening. I'm fascinated to find out more from him.
Well, hello. I hope you can hear me. Someone should gesticulate to, oh, good. Okay. Thank you, Alice. I'm going to share my screen now. I hope this works. You should be seeing a lot of clutter. And now I hope you actually see what I see, which is basically the front piece. Now, I cannot see anybody now, so I'll just take it for granted that you can see it, I hope. Unless, Claire, I'll rely on you to say if anything goes wrong.
We can see it.
Okay, good. Thank you all for coming today. I'm going to try to give you an overview of basically an impossible activity, and that's about 2,000 years of history and culture in the space of, I don't know, 40 minutes or so. For not one country, but 2. It just happens that they're side by side, and that makes it convenient, and they are as closely related as I guess England and France, and so the interactions and the connections are deep, very deep. I'm going to gallop along, and then I'm going to try to answer a few questions that came up earlier, that were put to me earlier at the end of my talk. So let's see if I can now get it to work, I hope. The first, here we go. Okay, yes, good. I'm going to try to break it into parts, and I'm going to try to talk about the past, the present, and the future. And I'm going to try to lay out a variety of periods too that saw, well, I refer to them as ecumenes, and by which I mean a period when they both basically shared the same culture. And then after the first ecumene, then there was a period in medieval times when they diverged. And then there was a second ecumene that picked up around 1600 where they essentially came back together. And now that ran into the modern period. And I would say that they're basically still together in many ways. But just to give you an idea of what I mean, deep into antiquity, the genetic makeup of these peoples is so close that they are almost the same people. And I can give you all kinds of data in that regard. If you look up at the top of the screen, you'll see Koreans and Japanese, and it's that red bit that overlaps a great deal. But there is a period, and the point of showing you this is that in this period from about 300 BC onwards until about 300 AD, there was a massive migration from the Korean peninsula into the Japanese islands. And we can see that in Japanese genetic material. And so as we reach the Kofun period, it stabilizes. And so present day Japanese are pretty much what they were at that time. And that is more or less at the end of this massive migration period. So modern day Japanese and Koreans are extremely closely connected genetically. The environment they live in is also very closely connected, which means they eat and have eaten almost the same types of food for millennia. As you can see, most of this is coming from the continent through the Korean peninsula. The most sophisticated there is, of course, rice, which means irrigation, which is an extremely technical piece of agriculture. I won't go into it, but I should say something about politics, which is often where this lecture is going to end up. Politically, then, the Koreans and the Japanese developed in parallel until about 1100 AD, and then they went separate ways, and this medieval period that I'll come to in a moment, and then from about 1600 to 1850, they came back together, and in many ways, even into modern times, they are still very closely connected. In deep antiquity, we have a number of peoples, tribal peoples identified on the peninsula, and the Chinese saw the Japanese, what we think of as the Japanese in the islands, as just one more tribal group out there to the east. But I mentioned the migration. There was heavy migration into the Japanese islands, setting up various political sites that became critical for the origin of Japanese culture and civilization, if you will. The amount of evidence we have for this activity crossing the sea is overwhelming. It's clear to one and all, and it has been clear. I want to stress there's nothing controversial about this at all. It is widely accepted both in Japan and Korea that this is the case. And then when we kind of see what these peoples were doing and how they were coping with the development of their states, if you will, the first thing that stands out is the question of legitimacy. The Korean kingdom of Goguryeo, and I'll come to it in just a moment, really came on the scene around 300 AD, and it established the first real kingdom, organized, centralized kingdom in Northeast Asia, by which I'm including the Japanese archipelago. But I'm showing you this illustration because Kingship for the Koreans and the Japanese is essentially the same thing. They have the same idea about it. It's very different from the Chinese. Kingship for the Koreans and the Japanese is a descent from heaven. And there is a myth in Korea about a man who was born of a god that descended from heaven and married an earthly woman, and they produced the progenitor of the Korean people. North Koreans, as you can see, have invested a great deal of capital into this myth. But the same thing was basically going on in Japan. And if we look at some of these huge tombs that we have from the Kofun period in Japan, circa 300 or so, from then into the 6th century, we see the same kind of thing. And when we look at Japanese ancient myths as well, we see, I don't know if my cursor is appearing, but if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the Korean foundation myth, and just below it, the Japanese foundation myth. And what we have is basically a descent to earth, a union of heaven and earth in marriage. What is different, though, is intriguing. The Koreans include no other names. So the god who descended from heaven and married an earthly woman did not meet people. This god met a bear tribe and a tiger tribe, and he chose the bear tribe as the provider of his wife. In the case of Japan, though, our descent to earth occurs, and the demigod meets other people. They have names. And this is a rather critical difference, which indicates the Japanese islands were already populated by people with civilization and culture by the time this migration occurred. Now, statecraft then, for both, really begins with this kingdom I just mentioned, Goguryeo, and it established the first real Chinese style of a centralized kingdom, and then basically exported that to these other tribes. In the southern part of the peninsula and the Japanese islands, they were, as I say, just loose tribal units, if you will. Goguryeo is rather sophisticated. It was a crossroads in Northeast Asia and imported art from Central Asia. These are not Chinese motifs, but the centralized impetus for the kingdom came from China. Both the Koreans and the Japanese looked at China as a source of power, wealth, and culture, and that power and wealth derived from its centralization, which will appear henceforth, basically. But the point is that the Korean culture, which was in many ways transmitted to the Japanese and then modified and adapted, partakes of Central Asia as well as China. Now, when we get a little farther along in time, say up to the 7th century AD, the disparate kingdoms on the peninsula are unifying, and this one on the right-hand side, kind of gray, Shilla, the capital was Gyeongju, which the tour in September will visit, made an alliance with the Tang Empire against its enemies in the southwest, Baekje, and its enemies in the north, Goguryeo. Tang had Goguryeo as an enemy as well. And so the alliance it worked until Tang basically, well, they sent massive armies, but then Tang attempted to stay in Korea and were eventually thrown out by the Koreans. The Chinese never really, I should add as an aside, never really succeeded in ruling Korea. And it was only in the late 600s, that was the last time they actually tried. But they were present in Korea on at least 2 later occasions for military activities in the 1590s and the 1950s. But I'll come to that. The type of statecraft, this looks very complicated. Don't worry about it too much. The point is that on the far right-hand side, you have a type of thing that you're born with. It's basically a caste. And that gives you access to everything on the left-hand side, which are bureaucratic appointments. So if you're born in this particularly exalted caste where you see the gray going all the way to the top of the graph, then you can have any office you please. This mixture of aristocracy and bureaucracy then marks Korean statecraft as well as Japanese statecraft for the next 2,000 years, and many would argue right into the present. But as I say, the model was China. Korea adopted a grid-like capital. And in the case of the Japanese islands, they were also playing with statecraft and trying to centralize the government. The basic difference there was not that you were born into a caste per se, but that you were born into a particular clan. Remember those names I mentioned when the demigod descended to earth and moved across the islands, meeting people with names. All of these names then had to be preserved for political reasons because they were powerful clans. So it didn't really depend on your caste per se, as much as it depended on your clan. Some were close, physically close to the imperial clan, some were far away, and that determined your rank and all that. But the Japanese, again, reproduced the same kind of grid-like capital as the Chinese, because that was the world model. Only, and at this point, I think we have to take note, what the Japanese did, though, was add an innovation to the centralized order. And if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see a circle around the Council of Kami Affairs. Again, remember those names that the demigod had to recognize. All of those names were semi-divine themselves, and they had to be incorporated into the state. So what you see on this illustration, most of it is Chinese in origin, but in that red circle on the left is a Japanese innovation, which basically bureaucratized heaven, as well as earth on the right. Now, turning to religion, though, of course, the Koreans and the Japanese were importing from the continent as well Buddhism, which is a world religion. What we have to recognize, though, is that Buddhism also possessed its own wealth, and that meant power. And so if we look at this national temple in Gyeongju, again, a city that the tour will visit, built in 750, we can see the major Buddhist sects represented. That was both for political and for religious reasons. You didn't want to leave anyone out. If we turn to Japan, we can see the same thing. There was a huge temple in Nara, the Todaiji, which has this enormous figure, as you can see. People are cleaning it. I'm sorry, these are just gratuitous photographs of beautiful things also in the temple compound. This is some of the best Tang Dynasty art that's left to us, these clay statuettes. But back to the point, the Japanese, of course, also had to incorporate all of the various Buddhist sects, but look at the blue. The blue is, again, those ancient other clans, and they were semi-deified, and they had to be incorporated into the religious order and given a prominent place. And so we see what we later, from the late 19th century, come to call Shinto. We see it present in the most important religious establishment in the country at the time. Now, let me move forward a bit into a period, the medieval times, when the two began to diverge. The major development on the Japanese islands was basically, and I'll come to it in Korea as well, was basically that the Japanese didn't have any difficulty defending themselves from the outside, which gave them the luxury of being able to kill each other rather than have to worry about killing foreigners. which also meant that that nice centralized government that came to exist by 800 AD began to dissolve. And the bits and pieces of it were privatized, including military force. These bushi then evolve into something later we call samurai, private security forces. And eventually by 1185, two large groups emerge and contend for power, the Genji and the Taira. And they fight literally to the death. But what that initiated, though, in the case of Japan, was a period of medieval atomization of politics and wealth. There was a nominal government. Well, this is where the Japanese become terribly complicated. There was always a central government in Kyoto, the imperial government. But from about 1185 onwards, it became rather powerless. It was displaced, or the power and wealth gravitated to the first bakufu, or the first tent government in Kamakura, the Kamakura bakufu, and it remained there until about the 1330s. Now, the good thing about Kamakura was that it kept the peace. But in the 1330s, an emperor in Kyoto tried to reassert the imperial government, was defeated, and from the 1330s onwards until, gosh, about the late 1500s, Japan began to descend into civil war. But from the 1330s, the wealth in Kyoto, another bakufu emerged in Kyoto, and the wealth and power moved back there, but it wasn't shared with the imperial government. But what that meant was that for several centuries in Kyoto, it became the center of religion, the center of money, the center of scholarship, and the center of power. And it is that power and wealth that you can see on display in the medieval beauty of Japan, which really is what we think of as traditional Japan. The Kitayama period, this poor building, I think, was burned down in 1950 by a mad monk, and it's been rebuilt. But this building, about a century later, in Higashiyama, on the other side of the city, it still survives from its origins in 1490. And so Kyoto is just littered with these fabulously beautiful buildings and gardens from that period. The main group that actually held power and held wealth, as I mentioned, were the bushi, these samurai. And so they sponsored what they enjoyed. To the point, they were men of action. And they really didn't have time to read books. But they were very content and very happy to study meditative arts, that is, particularly Zen Buddhism. And so they became sponsors of Zen Buddhism. And this is why Zen is so powerful and so dominant in Japan today, with its abstractions of a sea and islands in the sea represented in gardens. If we turn to the Korean Peninsula at the same time, we do not see the kind of disintegration that we see in Japan. Rather, what we do see is that Shilla did fall apart in the early 900s. And if you can see this arrow up in the upper right-hand corner, Koryo's Kaesong, what succeeded Shilla was a breakaway group in the north that established the Koryo Kingdom with its capital at Kaesong. Kaesong, by the way, is just across the demilitarized zone inside North Korea. And it's very much like Gyeongju down in the south. If you look in the lower right-hand corner of this slide, you'll see Shilla's Gyeongju, the capital, which the tour will visit. I'm afraid the tour cannot go to Kaesong in the north because it's on the other side of the DMZ. With British passports, you can't visit there on a tour. It's kind of an open-air museum, like Gyeongju is an open-air museum, and in many ways Nara as well. But the point I'm trying to make is that there was not a period of civil war in Korea. What happened was a rather peaceful transition, if you will, from Shilla to Goryeo in the early 900s. And then Goryeo ruled the country for the next 500 years until the end of the 1390s, and I will come to that. Now, I have to explain or say something about the relationship of the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese islands to the Chinese continent. And I've tried to give you this perspective from north to south, because this is the perspective that invading barbarians trying to get into the central Chinese plain, that's the big red arrow, would have to worry about. And that what they have to worry about is their left-hand flank, which is Korea. Every invading force into China has always had to deal with Korea. The Korean Peninsula is in many ways, the key to Chinese security. And as I'll point out in a moment, it's also the key to Japanese security, which makes it regrettably a focus of interest by both. Now, in historical times, I mentioned Goryeo came to power in the 900s, and it dealt with the Liao dynasty in the north and the powerful and magnificent Song dynasty on the continent in the south. But barbarians began to move in to China and sever the connections between the Koreans and the actual Chinese. Barbarians, I mean people from Manchuria. And eventually they're followed by the Mongols, who, as you can see, I'm trying to point out, essentially rule the world for a period of time. What we're interested really is in the Khanate that included Korea and launched an attack on Japan. Before the Koreans were taken by the Mongols in 1232, or that was the first invasion, I guess, the Koreans produced one of the most magnificent cultural items in world history. There are 80,000 of these wood blocks still surviving in South Korea today. They were at the time the most complete collection of Buddhist texts, including the texts that were extant in China, as well as other newly developed sutras that were written in Korea. This collection was not surpassed until the 20th century, when the Japanese produced a modern printed version. But the Mongol invasion for Japan, once they had Korea, then they launched an invasion of Japan, and it failed. It failed in the harbor of Hakata primarily because the Japanese put up quite a defense. Now, what you're looking at right now is an emaki, a scroll depicting the man who solicited the patron's military prowess. And so this is basically a piece of propaganda about his success against the Mongols. And you can, he boards the boat from the right, and then he actually appears in the far left. He's already slit the throat of one man, and he's going on to slit the throat of another Mongol. And he took this, you see, back to the Kamakura Bakufu and presented it in hopes of getting a reward. The thing about the Mongols for the Koreans and the Japanese is that they brought home to both of them a very strong self-awareness. I don't want to call it a national consciousness. Some people have, but I think that's a bit too much. But what we do see in the case of the Koreans are histories that then define themselves from the 12th, 13th century, define who they are and where they live. And they are defining themselves as a peninsular people, not a continental people. Of course, it's from the Mongol invasions that the Japanese get the concept of kamikaze, Shinkoku, land of the gods. The great winds came and protected us. And yes, in fact, typhoons did damage the fleets, the Mongol fleets. In fact, more or less destroyed them. But that was after the warriors, the Bushi, had held them on the beaches in Hakata. This memory is very deep. It resides within the Lotus Sutra sect of Buddhism in Japan, the progenitor of which was Nichiren, who warned of something horrible would happen if you don't believe in the Lotus Sutra. And sure enough, the Mongols arrived. Now, after the Mongols in the 1300s, if you recall the chaos in Japan that I've mentioned, the descent into civil war and such, what that really meant was that, for the rest of Asia that is, was that the Japanese lost the power to control their own seas. And so pirates swept out, first to Korea in the 1300s, and then on to the Chinese coast in later centuries. In the early 1400s, the Koryo kingdom fell for a number of reasons, one of which was the severity of Japanese piracy. It was replaced by another kingdom, a rather Confucianized kingdom called the Chosun. And the Chosun kingdom really, like medieval Japan, gives us our traditional Japan today. The Chosun kingdom gives us traditional Korea today. This is what people think of when they think of Korean tradition. And the high point of this is, of course, a king who ruled in the first part of the 1400s when the kingdom was just fresh. He was only the third king to come to the throne, and he was an extraordinary genius. And I don't use that word lightly. He not only defined literally the borders of the country, but I'm sorry to overload you with this, but he had something akin to an Oxbridge College established where scholars produced major books. And in the middle, in the orange, I hope you can see the most prominent of these studies, and that was the creation of the script itself. On this page, you can see both Chinese and Korean script. It is this king who we think actually personally roughed out an outline of the script, turned it over to some of the scholars to develop, and they came back with a full-blown conception of it. And that is being used by the Koreans today. Now, there was a time over the 1400s and into the 1500s when generally peace prevailed between the Koreans and the Japanese, and the Ming Dynasty, more or less the superpower, at that time a global superpower, held the peace in all of East Asia. But at the end of the 1500s, the Japanese more or less came out of their civil wars and were reunited by a warlord, Hideyoshi. And then Hideyoshi, for some reason, I have a student working on a DPhil at the moment trying to work out why he invaded Korea. Ostensibly, we know he wanted to rule the world. And I'm not exaggerating. The plan was first we conquer Korea, then we conquer China, and then Hideyoshi goes to China to plan the invasion of India. Nevertheless, what that meant actually on the ground was that they got into Korea and bogged down. They lost the war before they could get out of Korea. The devastation to the Koreans was extraordinary. I don't know if you can see this very clearly, but if you just look at the lines, you'll see the dip in population because of the war. And it took good 50, 60 years for the population to recover again. But after it did, we move into the 17th century and into this second ecumenical period that I like to refer to, whereby the Japanese now have pulled themselves back together into a unified state under the Edo Bakufu, or the Tokugawa Bakufu, located in modern-day Tokyo. The Chosun dynasty survived, and so from about 1600 onwards, they shared a world order and a cosmopolitan space. And they had envoys visiting each other. Koreans would go and take letters addressed to the shogun from the Korean king. It was quite a grand affair. Numerous scrolls depicting this thing were produced. We have a few here in this country. And this one in particular I like, at the British Museum. And if we look closely, we get a crowd scene from Edo, Japan. And if I don't know if you can see it, but there's some upper class women in the lower right-hand corner wearing scarves over their heads. There's some monks with a shaved head. And then there are a couple of blokes in sort of the left foreground who clearly look intoxicated to me, and they're getting into a fight with somebody. And but everyone is turning out to watch the Koreans go by because it was such a weird and exotic thing. They didn't get to see foreigners very often, and so it was quite a popular thing. But if we move into the present, we still have the problem of a shared geopolitical space. And when Japan came under pressure from the imperial powers, the European and American imperial powers, they reorganized themselves. The feudal order essentially reconstituted itself by sponsoring again the imperial government, which had never disappeared. It was still there in Kyoto on paper. They simply revived it and brought it into a power, and that is into a situation that they were able to control, that is the sponsors of this government, who were essentially warlords from an earlier period. But they fell apart over before I get on, let me say, they fell apart over the question of Korea. And the question of Korea was, they sent letters to the Koreans saying, we have reestablished a state. This is the Meiji government. This is modern Japan. And the Koreans refused to recognize them, which the Meiji founders found to be an insult. And in fact, Saigo Takamori, you can see his name there sitting in the middle. He was he's a very robust figure. He's a very robust figure. I think Hollywood did a movie with him, The Last Samurai. Of course, we have, the American actor Tom Cruise, who really, that's fiction, by the way, but he was, in fact, rebelling against the government over what The Last Samurai doesn't tell you is the actual question, which was really the question of what to do with Korea. They had insulted us. Saigo wanted to go to Busan, get into a fight, be assassinated, and then that would give the Meiji government a reason to invade. Okubo, on the right-hand side, as you can see, thought, no, this is not a good idea. It will make us vulnerable to the Euro-American imperialist, and so forget that. Saigo left the government, and it created a civil war. So I will come back to this again. The point is that Korea is at the heart of modern Japan, the Korean security question. The security question about Korea becomes so prominent that eventually it spirals into the annexation of Korea in 1910. And then the Japanese Empire felt it had to protect Korea, and that led to the establishment of Manchukuo. Then they had to protect Manchukuo, and that led to the invasion of China in 1937. And so we're into the Pacific War by that time, because shortly thereafter, they attacked the Americans in order to protect their supply routes to Southeast Asia. Towards the end of the war, though, the Allies at Mina House in Cairo declared that Korea would be free and independent in the future from the Japanese. Of course, at that time, it was Japanese. And so the Allies were trying to divide it. I show you this only because you probably recognize it. This is the surrender, the Japanese surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. The man who signed the surrender, Shigemitsu Mamoru, is holding a cane because his left leg was blown off by a bomb planted by a Korean anarchist. I told you that Korea is at the heart of modern Japan. You don't have to go very far to find it. When the war ended, the Americans took occupation of the south of the Korean Peninsula. The Soviets, as you know, took occupation of the North. And there is a question as to how that happened. The best argument I've seen thus far is that we do know that these two men, Dean Rusk and I can't remember his given name, Bonesteel, were given the task of trying to divide the peninsula. That is where the Soviet army should stop in its southward advance. And all they had on hand was this 1904 National Geographic map, which they pulled out, drew a line at the 38th parallel, and the Soviets accepted it. And that's why we have the division there. The argument about this is that the map is so crude, it doesn't have the provincial boundaries. And so the line probably would have been a little different. As it is, it cut through two provinces. Well, this is modern history, of course. And by 1948, the Republic of Korea had been established in the South as the only legitimate government on the Korean Peninsula. But of course, the North established the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, both of these under sponsorship by their Cold War patrons. And then Kim Il-sung set about organizing himself for the Korean War, what we call the Korean War from the 1950s. He had to get the approval of Stalin, who said, first, you have to get an agreement from Mao, because if you get into trouble, I'm not going to help you. Mao must do that. And Kim Il-sung was successful. The war opened, as you know, in June 1950, an extraordinary advance from the North. I show you this because if you look in the lower right-hand corner, I mean, they were driven back to the Busan perimeter. And then, of course, Douglas MacArthur made this daring landing on the west coast of Korea. Now, this is rather extraordinary to me because in the three wars that I've mentioned on the Korean Peninsula, the war in the 600s, the war in the 1590s, and now the war in 1950, the key to success in the war was to have access to the west coast. It is an extremely difficult place to land a ship because they're tidal flats. But in the 600s, the Chinese had access, and they were successful with their ally, who's basically located where the Busan perimeter was, the Kingdom of Shilla. In the 1590s, Hideyoshi had no ally, and he was never able to get into the Western Sea, which would have allowed him to connect his logistics at the very north to go into China, but he failed to do that, and that's why they bogged down in Korea. MacArthur was successful. He landed at Incheon and thereby pushed the North Koreans back. The only problem was that he ignored the Chinese warnings, which had very little to do with communist comradeship and had everything to do with Chinese empire. You simply do not get close to China through Korea. You simply don't do that. The reason the Koreans are allowed to be free is because they're our buffer. But if you come into Korea, we will attack you. Basically, the Chinese fought in the 600s, they fought again in the 1590s, and they fought again in the 1950s. And they pushed the UN forces back south, and it was horrible beyond belief, and now it's stabilized. Where the DMZ was. The tragedy of the war was multiple. Mao Zedong lost his own son in the war. Of course, Pablo Picasso gives us a pretty accurate depiction of it, I think. One of the major winners, of course, was Syngman Rhee. His country survived, the Republic of Korea. Japan, though, was probably the biggest winner of the war because they were not directly engaged, but they were the logistics and quartermastering for the Allied effort, which meant that it jump-started the Japanese economy after the Pacific War. And this is the early 1950s, within a decade, we have the bullet train. Now, in the present, both the Republic of Korea and the Japanese are industrial economies that cater to consumers. The industry and the heritage of modernization in Korea really goes back to the colonial period. And the idea of the Japanese rule there by the Japanese was not exactly that of exploitation. It was more of bringing civilization to the Koreans. And if you see the Korean man and woman, our younger brothers, the light of Amaterasu Omikami, the great deity of Japan, remember the divine origins of the people, is being, is shining down upon them, and the future looks bright. But it is from this period that we see literally the Korean industrial bourgeoisie appearing. The men who go on to create the Samsung Corporation or the Hyundai Corporation, or what we know as the LG Corporation, come out of this period. The political systems are both in Japan and South Korea, of course, basically liberal democracies. The DPRK is simply a reaction to liberalism, I believe. But this history is very checkered. Ito Hirobumi, who wrote the Meiji Constitution, was assassinated by a Korean in 1909 while waiting for a train in Harbin Station. This man, An Chong-gun, who did it, I show you this postage stamp from the 1980s. 200 won was the price of that stamp, and that was just about the amount of money it took for that letter to get from South Korea to Japan, but nowhere else. And so the assassin of the father of modern Japan was flooding into Japan for decades on letters. The complexity of the war effort in China meant that the Japanese were mobilizing everyone, and here was a bit of propaganda, that is Japan and Korea as one body, which also led to the elimination of Japanese names. This is the late 1930s, by the way, and it meant also the creation of that phenomenon we refer to as the comfort women, and also male Koreans were hired and taken to Japan for labor. Most of them actually signed contracts. Some of them were press ganged. But this also meant a time when the Koreans had to change their names into Japanese names and use the Japanese language. You can't use your own language. So this is the modern memory of the relations between the two. After the war, Korea was dominated by kind of a right-wing dictatorship, that is South Korea, and a left-wing dictatorship in the north, Kim Il-sung, until about 1960 in the South, when a student revolution led to the toppling of Kim Il-sung. He was replaced in a military coup d'etat by Park Chung-hee. And for a few decades, the generals ran the show, but they were engaged in what you might think of as a developmental activity. Now it's a civilian government and a very strong democracy, very healthy, and will continue. The North, I'm afraid, is descending into, or has already descended into, an empire, a dynasty, if you will. But life goes on in a very ordinary way, both North and South. The future, I should say something about this. I've already mentioned that the Japanese, modern Japan, has a fear of Korea as being a launching pad for attack on itself. Koreans have a great deal of self-loathing because they feel as though they allowed the Japanese to take them. And there are some details about this, but basically, I've already mentioned most of these points. The challenge, though, for the Japanese henceforward is to learn to trust the Koreans and simply to live in the same space. and then how to come to grips with their own aggression in the 20th century, which I don't think they actually have. The problem for the Koreans is that Japan introduced modernity. And so modernity and Japanization went hand in hand, and that's why it's left a particularly deep scar for modern Koreans, both North and South. And so there's a great deal of self-loathing. Who among us is to blame for the Japanese annexation? When they can forgive themselves, I believe they will finally be able to forgive the Japanese. And of course, the instability that we all face for the future is the division. The Japanese are attempting to make peace with the North. The South is attempting to make peace with the North. And even the Americans have made sort of an attempt to make peace with the North, but the North lives in a garrison mentality. And it's very hard to break them out of that. But God willing, the future will. These are just some readings. I'll stop here and say a couple of things, if I can, about some of the questions that were raised. Actually, I think if you write to Claire and ask for these readings, she could probably send them to you, because I'm going to stop sharing at this point. There are a couple of good histories and some fiction, both traditional and modern. And let's see if I can now pull up, oh yes, some questions. Taoism, I was asked about Taoism. Yes, it's very prominent in all of East Asia. You can't go very far without finding it everywhere. How long have I lived in Asia? I don't know exactly. I lived about.
Jay, we've had a few questions.
Yes.
I kind of feel it's more focused on the future.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that if I'm going to summarize what we've seen, it's how does what you've said affect how does Korea view Japan and Japan view Korea?
Right.
You've answered those questions, but that, you know, particularly in view of what's happened in Ukraine.
Well, I'm a historian. I'm not a political scientist, and so I'm not really. I'm rather loath to talk about contemporary affairs that appear in yesterday's newspaper, and the reason is we won't really know how any of this works out for another 20 or 30 years. All we can do is muddle.
But we want to put you on the spot.
I know, and I will say that there were some questions about South Korea and Japan facing China, but you know, they've always done that. This is the situation that we think is developing at the moment with a large, inordinately wealthy and powerful China is the normal historical situation in East Asia. We have to get used to it. The last 150 years were an aberration. We're now moving back into a normal time when China controlled that part of the world. And in fact, several times over the past 2 millennia, they have controlled the world economy. So we cannot go into this with fear and loathing. We have to learn to deal with it. Its connection with the Russians, I couldn't even fathom a guess. Again, all this will change week to week, if not day to day.
Yeah, no, I sense the interest is where the is there a difference from what I'm gathering the questions between the two countries, how they view the future?
Yes.
With one another.
Yes, that really is an important question, and it's the Koreans and the Japanese will never be able to escape each other. They, like the English and the French, they just simply have to learn to live with each other. That's just the way it will always be and the way it always has been. But in modern times, and what I mean is from the late 19th century, the Japanese have developed a fear of Korea. And it's a fear of someone else using it to launch an attack on them. And that's mostly what propelled their expansion into Manchuria and then on into China. And that led to the Pacific War. The Koreans have always looked at the Japanese as a barbarian people to whom they have given everything. The problem for the Koreans, though, is that in the 20th century, they were given modernization by the Japanese. And so this is the ambivalence that they have towards modernity in general. So there's a great deal of exchange, there's a great deal of fear and loathing, but the connections between the two are extraordinarily deep. The languages, grammatically, are very close. They're closer than any other languages in the region. They're both very different from the Chinese, linguistically, genetically, and I would argue culturally and politically too. And so they will inevitably go into the future in some kind of modus operandi, and hopefully learn to live with each other a little better.
I mean, another question that's come out, it may be topical, but is there any bearing between the relationship between England and Britain and the EU and Japan and Korea?
Yes, that was a rather interesting question. I more or less alluded to it by saying, in many ways, the British and the Japanese have one serious thing in common. They're both islands, and that makes them highly defensible. Although in the case of the British Isles, they've been invaded numerous times by other peoples, but they, for that reason, they have an aloofness from the continent. The Koreans, like the French, have never had that, or even the German peoples have never had that kind of aloofness. They can't. They have land borders with aggressive powers, and they have to deal with that. And that has dominated their politics. While the Japanese were disintegrating in medieval times, the luxury of being able to kill each other, the Koreans did not have that luxury. They always had to maintain a central government in order to defend the northern frontier, because tribes from Manchuria were constantly probing. But I dare say, yes, there were a number of questions, and I don't know if I'm getting to everything that I wanted to, but and people are asking the obvious questions. Why did Korea refuse to recognize the Meiji government? Primarily because the Meiji government sent letters that used the word emperor, and this was irregular diplomatic correspondence for East Asia. Much as in if Rishi Sunak were to receive a letter from Kim Jong-un signed by Kim Jong-un, God, what would Rishi Sunak do with such a letter? Well, you politely turn it back to the ambassador and you kindly ask him to rewrite it and put in a title that is intelligible to us. That is chairman of the government or chairman of the party or something of this nature. Basically, the use of imperial in the Japanese letters was a declaration that the Japanese had left that ecumenical period, that common cosmopolitan framework that had been in existence for the previous 250 years, and were in danger of embarking on something new and different. And every time the Japanese do that, the Koreans, particularly the Koreans on the coast, suffer. And so the letters were rejected, politely asking them to eliminate this character for emperor. North Korea, how many generations of cultural change would be needed for a successful I have no idea. I really have no idea. The North Korean situation is truly not exactly communist or socialist, but it partakes of that, but it also partakes of dynasty. and extraordinary control. And North Koreans are terribly patriotic. You have to remember that in the years of the Korean War, Pyongyang, one of the most beautiful and ancient cities in East Asia, was turned to rubble. Not once or twice, but 6 or 8 times. The Koreans learned to live underground during that war. They have a deep hatred of the Americans, first of all, and anyone who makes an alliance with the Americans. And so I have no idea, but it would be nice when they feel secure. When they finally feel secure, I think there will be some kind of reintegration. What does it mean that 2 languages are genetically related? I'm not sure. I'd have to talk to my linguist colleagues, but I do think that it goes back to a common origin. The question is, was there a common origin for these 2 languages? And the debate is unsettled, shall we say. At the moment, I think the argument is that no, there wasn't a common origin. We don't really know because we can't find these languages elsewhere. We find similarities elsewhere in the Turkish languages. Japanese may be a Creole of Korean with Southeast Asian languages. Who knows? But the extraordinary overlap was early on, the grammatical, syntactical overlap. And then all of that was overlaid with a common vocabulary that came from China, because everything modern came from China: politics, history, literature.
You were conscious of time, but I think the final, and maybe you've addressed this, is something between the North and South Korea divide, and whether that gives any instruction about where the future is between the relationship between the 2 countries.
The division between North and South.
We've had a few questions that way.
Yes, I know. And I hesitate to talk about contemporary history too much, but the great tragedy is that they have been divided now since 1953, definitely, and certainly since 1950 when the war broke out, which means that the languages are beginning to diverge ever so slightly. The importation of foreign terms for modern technology in the South is quite pervasive. And today you can hear modern educated South Koreans mixing in Koreanized technical vocabulary as well as English words. To North Koreans, most of that is unintelligible. So there is definitely a cultural divide opening up. I dare say that both North and South, there is this extreme romantic vision of the future when they will be united. And there's a great tradition of Southern boys who have made success in business and elsewhere marrying beautiful Northern girls. And that comes out of the Chosun period over hundreds of years. And so I dare say that lives on in a large number of minds. I think it rather depends on how secure the North will finally feel itself to be. In the year 2000, when Kim Dae-jung went to North Korea, it was a breakthrough in the South because it was really an indication that the Southerners felt secure and confident in their own success, confident enough to let their president go to North Korea, where he could have been assassinated on the tarmac. He wasn't. And that fact, I think, indicates that the North is quite interested in making some kind of arrangement. But it's going to take a great deal of time. There's a great income gap between the two, a standard of living gap that the Germans spent decades and decades trying to close between East and West Germany. The Koreans have not done that. They have transferred some wealth to the North to try to close that gap, but for political reasons, that's now almost impossible.
Jay, I'm conscious of time.
Yes.
Thank you very much for a wonderful summary of a very complicated position and situation between Korea and the rest of the world. I'm going to sign it off now. If anybody's interested in any journeys, then please contact Distant Horizons or Temple World. But thank you, Mr. Lewis, for a wonderful introduction to it.
You're all quite welcome. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye. I'm going to say bye-bye.